Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining in, Beam. I am Shikha Devakar, doctoral candidate at McGill University. I'm from Dalit community, and my research focuses on Dalit women identity, their lived experiences, and higher education policy. I am very excited today for this event where we hope to draw on profound theoretical and political knowledge, as well as leadership of Dalit, Indigenous, and Black communities in building the movement to protect civil and human rights in the university system. Today's event is organized by Poetic Justice Foundation and the Department of Integrated Studies in Education, McGill University. There is a power in building together and creating change on the ground level, as well as in forms of policy and challenging structures when academic and community-based organizations collaborate. The unique partnership also brings down walls and make these important conversations more accessible. Poetic Justice Foundation is a community-based organization that challenges structures of oppression and discrimination through intersectional grassroots advocacy. They develop content, workshops, and events to provoke, challenge, and disrupt systemic inequities and biases. They create inclusive spaces for exploration, learning, and healing to foster societal change. Their goal is to educate and empower Canadians to achieve and protect equal rights in all aspects of social, political, and economic life. DICE is committed to the preparations and training of exceptional professionals in education and related fields. The department engages in research in the area of pedagogy, curriculum, literacy, education, education policy, and education leadership. So on the behalf of both organization and panelists, I would like to now warmly welcome Watseneosta Nelson, a member of Mohawk Nation from the small community of Kanesatake, a member of Beer Clan and graduate student pursuing her MA at McGill University in educational leadership, to do the land acknowledgement before we proceed. Thank you.
Stego, everyone. So we respectfully acknowledge that we are currently on the traditional lands of numerous Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit communities. We recognize that this land we call Turtle Island, also known as North America, has been cared for by these Indigenous communities since before the arrival of settler peoples until today. We recognize that this panel presentation taking place in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, is the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka. It is crucial that non-Indigenous peoples today take this moment to self-reflect upon their roles in disrupting and/or maintaining oppressive structures, and how we must work further together towards emancipation and liberation for our families and communities. We offer our gratitude to Indigenous peoples for their care and teachings about Mother Earth and the territory we reside in today. Yawa.
Thank you so much. Let me introduce the moderator of this session today, Dr. Joel Levitan, who is an assistant professor and graduate program director in the Department of Integrated Studies and Education, McGill University. He is also a co-founder of Sacred Valley Project and Pallata Community Education Center in the Peruvian Andes. His research and practice center on socially just educational change and leadership approaches. Welcome, Joe.
Great, thank you, Shikha. And thank you everyone for putting this panel together, the entire team from the Poetic Justice Foundation. So welcome everybody. Thanks for showing up today. I'm going to introduce our esteemed panel and then ask a couple questions. The idea is that we'll have about 10 minutes for each question, but because this is such an important and rich topic, we may extend some time for certain topics if we do that. But what I'm going to do is go through a number of questions after introducing our esteemed panelists. So first is Shaista Aziz Patel, who works as a scholar of critical Muslim studies in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, San Diego. Her scholarly and other political work address questions of multiple colonialisms, caste, race, and Muslimness. She identifies as Pakistani Shi'a Muslim feminist. Robert, so welcome, Shaista. Thanks for being here. Robert Alexander Innes is a citizen of the Cowessee First Nation located in Treaty 4 territory. He is the chair of the Indigenous Studies Department at McMaster University. He is the author of Elder Brother and the Law of the People, Contemporary Kinship and Cowessee First Nation, 2013. His current research examines the Indigenous genocide that occurred in southern Saskatchewan in the 1880s. Rob, if I may. Welcome. Thanks for being here. Ronaldo Walcott is a professor and chair of Africana and American Studies at the University of Buffalo SUNY, where he is the Carl V. Granger Chair in Africana and American Studies. His last book is The Long Emancipation, Moving Towards Black Freedom, published by Duke in 2021. Ronaldo, thank you very much for being here. All right, so let's get started. What I'd like to do is just talk about the overarching question and why we brought everybody together here, frame a little bit of what we're going to talk about, and then engage in a question for you all to answer. And I'm really looking forward to your answers. So the overarching question we want to address, contextualize, and critically engage with in this panel are, how does higher education affect students' identity development? And how are individuals from different identity groups affected by the continuing impact and structures of colonialism, bigotry, and racism? So that's the overarching question, but we're going to break that down into smaller segments because that's a lot. We couldn't do that in 90 minutes. We couldn't do that in probably a lifetime of scholarship, but we're going to work on that. So we'd like to hear from you based on both your experience and your expertise in research, because experience and research in this area are very often interconnected. In order to discuss these broad and complex questions, we have broken down these overarching questions into themes. Each panelist will have 4 minutes to respond to specific points, and then we will have time for broader discussion after we have covered some of the foundations of this question. Before we begin, I would like to frame this conversation with a foundational point. There's a serious danger in generalizing or overgeneralizing about groups. People embody a number of identities, such as group cultural and social identities, personal identities, and role identities, which can inform and influence how an individual engages with the social and physical world around them. It is very important to be thoughtful about contextualizing specific instances and thinking about how these instances translate across contexts or not, and then build out our conclusions. Whether in the name of social justice or bigotry, generalizations are problematic, so we need to walk carefully through understanding our social and personal realities. To think through this more, we have invited you all, our esteemed scholars, from different positionalities, identities, and perspectives here today, in order to discuss how we can understand experiences and overarching oppressive structures that run throughout society, while being aware that they affect and impact people from same groups and different groups in different ways, depending upon the identities that each person embodies. So it is important to think about these issues with critical precision to ensure that our work deeply transforms society towards more socially just realities. In that vein, I want to now open the conversation with our first question. The general theme is over safety. So much research, including yours, you all, has shown that higher education institutions underestimate the degree to which continuing and existent legacies of colonialism, cultural hegemony, bigotry, racism, and other forms of oppression affect students from non-dominant identities. Although many faculty and staff are in principle against oppressive systems and harmful/bigoted actions, most underestimate the effects of ongoing colonialism and the need for greater safety of students in order for students from non-dominant identities to be able to express themselves, function within and navigate higher education, and grow and learn. So my question is, what are some of the ways that students from non-dominant identities lack safety? And I will start with, just for this one, and then we're going to kind of open it up. I'd like to start with Rob, if that's okay.
Sure, thanks. And I'd just like to thank the organizer for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm really looking forward to discussions that will take place today. What are some of the ways they, well, I can speak generally in terms of Indigenous students, especially in the context that we're in right now, the era of indigenization of universities in Canada as a result of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action in 2015, which has really seen lots of initiatives across the country and hiring of Indigenous faculty, new programs, and what we're seeing, I guess, is one of the ways in which many Indigenous students are still, even within this context of indigenization and a greater awareness of Indigenous people experience with residential schools, especially after the discovery of the unmarked graves in many cemeteries across the residential cemeteries across the country. So there's been a greater awareness in Canada and much more mainstream than ever before about Indigenous issues. And certainly many universities have responded in various ways. And what we're seeing, I guess, is on the one hand, these great initiatives and a greater effort for inclusion of Indigenous peoples and perspectives. And so a lot of progress on one hand, but at the same time, there's some stalling of progress, superficial kind of initiatives where there's real emphasis on photographs and pamphlets and social media kind of PR kind of images of what universities are doing, and but not a lot in terms of in-depth sort of roll up your sleeves and get the actual work done. And also, because there's a number of initiatives, there's and because of the wanting to include Indigenous voices, especially Indigenous student voices, there's a lot of work that's being placed on Indigenous students to be a part of committees and be a part of developing policies that it's unpaid labor that students are being asked to do. And it's interesting because a lot of the stuff that Indigenous students are being required to do and the extra labor that they're required to do is things that non-Indigenous students, but particularly white students, are not really asked to do, right? So, and then in many universities, depending on the universities, certainly universities like McGill, like McMaster, that traditionally haven't had a huge Indigenous presence, and say unlike universities like Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, where there's a bigger presence of Indigenous presence on campus, Indigenous students are now required to not only sit on committees and to be the voice of the Indigenous community and the added labor, but they're in many cases are being asked to be the expert in the classrooms, right? So where professors will turn to students for their input, and putting them on the spot, and so that there's those kinds of issues. And at the same time, in some universities, there are Indigenous content course requirements in which Indigenous students are taking along with people who don't necessarily want to take those courses. And so there's a real fear from a lot of Indigenous students about how safe is it for them in these kinds of classes, where many comments and microaggressions and will take place. So there's on one hand, there's some progress being made for Indigenous students, but on the other hand, it's placing a lot more expectations that other students are not burdened with. And I think that in some ways, this could be a growing period kind of thing that's going on, but there's also the reality of what is happening right now for these particular students in these particular classrooms and on specific campuses.
Great, thank you. So at Shaista's request, I'd like to have Ronaldo respond second.
Tricky, Shaista, tricky. It's lovely to be here with you, Shaista. I haven't seen you in a while, and with you, Rob. So thank you for organizing what I hope will be a spirited and inviting conversation. I guess for me, this kind of question of safety and the modern university strikes at one of the deepest contradictory or paradoxical moments of the modern university for Black people in particular. And what I mean by that is so much of the modern university, the knowledge that's created in the modern university is used to perpetuate the idea that Black people are less than human, not human, outside the category of the human, and so on. So the modern university itself is a site of violence to Black people when we enter it. And it doesn't matter under what auspices we enter it, whether as a student, a faculty member, a worker, and so on. The university itself as an institution has been launched against Black people and Black life since the post-emancipation, the post-Columbus period, but well into the contemporary moment. I could cycle through all of the kinds of studies that come out of universities that try to prove that Black people have lower IQs, that we're more criminal, and all of these kinds of things. And I could give you the names of the people who have done them and so on. But I'm less interested in that and more interested in the way in which, kind of riffing off of some of what Rob said, the manner in which the modern university has tried to, if you will, induct some Black people, I call them the EDI professionals, but they don't only come as selling EDI, they come as deans, they come as presidents and so on. And what they get inducted into is a white supremacist institution that is in no way attempting to change. It is no way attempting to even slightly reform itself in terms of the violences that it enacts on Black people's everyday lives. But instead, what it does is it offers up these individual representations as both evidence of its goodness and its reform, and two, as a way to contain more radical critiques of what a university should be and could be. So the question for me around safety is in many ways, not so much a non-question, but it's a question that should alert us to the fact of what should we be doing. And to me, what we should be doing is engage in significant forms of refusal, in significant forms of attempting to undo the university and offer it back to itself in ways that is not recognizable. And I don't think that we can just do that through student activism. I think that all of us who work in the university, whether we're students, faculty, janitorial staff, and so on, have to understand the university as an institution that sits in a very particular place in terms of an institution that helps to maintain and distribute the unequal resources that we all try to share on this planet. And so for me, the university has never been a safe place. It can't be made a safe place under its current conditions. And so when Black people enter the university, whether we're conscious of it or not, we enter the university in a contestatory mode. And even those individual Black people who have been tapped on the shoulder to represent the university, I'm sure that in their quiet moments, they also feel the manner in which the violence of the institution shapes what it is that they're able to do and achieve. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you. Shaista.
Thank you. I just want to begin with saying thank you to Professor Joe Levitan and Shikha Divakar, who organized this panel, and the Department of, I think it's Integrated Education at McGill. I also want to say thank you to Professors Rob Innes and Ronaldo Walcott. Both have been my teachers, and Ronaldo in particular knows me as somebody who tried to hide in the back always. So I'm actually really nervous sharing the screen with him. I never thought it would happen, but I just want to say that, it's through the leadership and teachings of both of these professors that I was introduced to some of the, most radical, grounded, and, scholars that shaped my thinking, both Indigenous and Black, and I was introduced to those in their classes. So I just want to say thank you. So coming from UCSD, which is an extremely, I used to know the stats, actually, I can't remember right now, but it is extremely anti-Black, extremely anti-Indigenous university where ancestors are found in labs, so that's the kind of anti-indigeneity doesn't cut it. Like, it's genocidal, and it's genocidal for Black people, it's genocidal for Indigenous people. So, coming from a university like that, which is also extremely Hindu nationalist, with a chancellor who is Brahmin, it feels really weird to talk about, to tackle the question of safety. So I hope that, and I always believe that in my short teaching career, I've always said to my students that, the questions that we ask are more important than the answers we think we are giving. So I hope that today we can generate more questions, because how often have Indigenous, Black, Dalit, Muslim, scholars, theorists come together to think about these questions. So, this question, Joe, of safety, I want to think about, both Rob and Ronaldo talked about it, but what does it mean to talk about safety in a moment of genocide, right? And so the moment of genocide, whether it's 1441, 1492, or 2,500 years, as it is for caste violence, what does it mean to think about safety? Reminds me of this white woman, who I won't name, though, I mean, whatever, but one of the first courses that I taught from my own courses it was at University of Toronto, Scarborough, and it was called Violence Against Women. And when we are young, we are so we think we are the most radical and blah, blah. And I designed this course outline without any experience of having ever taught undergrads before. And she looked at the course outline and she's like, well, when we talk about violence against women, we mean campus safety. And, this was maybe 15 years ago now. And that has stayed with me, that, how white people, how dominant caste South Asians, the ways in which they think about safety is not how those of us who have been dehumanized in ways that we don't even remember now, almost 3 centuries, 3,000 years, 3 millennia later, talk about safety. And so, so building on what both of these scholars have said before me, I also think of safety in terms of future making, right? And so, Rob, you talked about indigenizing and how Indigenous students and scholars, particularly, junior scholars, are recruited and set up for failures necessarily, and so when they cannot perform, it's their fault, not the fault of the system that sets up, that exoticizes them. And, I feel that it's the same sort of thing that is happening with Dalit students. It's been, and my last name protects me, so I'm not gonna, not talk about the fact that my last name, which is a dominant caste name, which has been adopted via 2 different last names. My original last name is so attached to violence, the occupation that we used to do, that when my ancestors had a chance, they changed our last name, which is the story of many Dalits, who particularly end up in diaspora with their privileged caste last names. And so, there is, and I lost my train of thought, but to get back to this question of safety and thinking about future making, I do want to say that, it's in the same way that now Dalits who have been entering academia, whether it's in India / South Asia or in diaspora, our history is only, that 2 decades long. So it's not that we've been entering academia or that we had this whole whereas anti-caste work is as old as caste, but still entry into this, normative form of education, normative spaces of education is not that old for us in a larger sense. And so when we now enter academia, we see ourselves become the possession of dominant caste people. One of the things that really bothers me, and I think that is absolutely attached to questions of safety is how all South Asians, we are just seen as one. You know, we are seen as one. We are seen as culturally homogenous. People understand caste to be something that we brown people fight over among, you know, it's our infighting. Nobody understands caste, or rather it is not a common understanding that just like race, caste is also a vertical rather than a lateral system of dehumanization that is 2,500 years old. And Dalits, you know, ever since we've become untouchable, which is the history of, you know, 2,500 to 3,000 years old, we have not known what it is to be human outside of that, even when we have tried to accrue cultural capital through lying about, you know, our histories, through, you know, changing our last names. And that, for me, the fact that we are seen as homogenous, the fact that, you know, every time our struggles are mentioned, particular kinds of post-colonial scholars, particular kind of, you know, subaltern studies, Gayatri Spivak, for example, who is extremely casteist and violent towards us, when these are the people that are cited by scholars, you know, who are at the forefront of liberation otherwise, these are the things that I think are extremely attached to questions of safety. And so I think an education on caste, an education about why is, you know, who are we citing? Who are we, you know, who do we assume to be allies of these brown students that we have accepted into our program? That is really important. I mean, the ways in which I have seen Dalit and Adivasi, which are indigenous to India, and again, Adivasis are also the caste, outside the caste system, the, you know, the four-tiered caste system. They are also, you know, I've seen what happens to them when they are assigned dominant caste scholars. I see, you know, how they are exoticized, how they are reduced into just commodities. And last thing I want to say is, you know, make space. And I'm not going to ask university, you know, especially building on, you know, or drawing inspiration from what Professor Rinaldo Walcott said. I'm not going to ask the university to make space for that, because fuck that, you know, we can make our own spaces. It's just that, you know, if you are allies and you understand that, you know, we have also been dehumanized in ways that go beyond bestiality, because, you know, in Hinduism, gods are also painted as or made into half beast. So dehumanization, thinking with Black and Dalit studies, allows us to think about dehumanization as beyond bestiality. But, you know, if you allow, you know, those of you who are at the forefront of liberation, make space for us, work with us so that we can conceptualize other futures together. And this is not just theory or Shaista being too theoretical. This is really about our lives. Those of us who almost dropped out of our PhDs, those of us, you know, people like me who, until I was rescued by an Indigenous scholar, failed my proposal 5 times working with a woman of color because she could not understand what I was saying about caste. And you know, it for my communities, it would have been lost if I had dropped out of my PhD. So I will end here. Sorry if that was too long. Thank you.
No, that was very powerful. Thank you. I think that based on these comments, it would be really great to start thinking big, because everybody mentioned futures and future making and responses. And I think moving towards responses after thinking about what has happened and come before where we are, it would be really helpful to think about how we understand power issues and maybe engage in some question about power and power issues in higher education, the academy and in universities, and how we might respond or make futures with that. So I guess we can continue if you want some clarification on that question. I'm happy to do that. But the question is really about how do we engage in analysis of power to respond, to resist, to create, to future make, and what do we do now? And I guess we can continue with the same order if that's okay, or if somebody else would like to hop in, feel free to raise your hand and jump in. Looks like you're up, Rob.
Okay, so you know, so for me, I think, am I on? Yeah, I'm on. So for me, I think I think for Indigenous, talking about from perspectives of Indigenous students, I think that you know, for Indigenous students who are coming from communities reserve or remote communities, or from urban communities, especially in the West, where there are neighborhoods of Indigenous people. And coming to a university is very alien in a lot of ways, in the ways in how to navigate a university. But I think that one of the things that are beneficial in a university setting is, taking classes that are looking at, historical and contemporary, in looking at historical and contemporary issues from Indigenous scholars and instructors who have the experience of going through the universities, of the social and economic experiences of racism, and how they have challenged the universities simply by existing in a university, and challenging how the structures have been put in place to help explain why Indigenous people are facing the kinds of struggles historically and contemporary. And I think that from my experience, I think this has been really helped greatly by looking and reading and learning about from Black scholars, feminist scholars, queer scholars, and the way in which those scholars and those kinds of criticism and critical engagement with the power structures have influenced Indigenous people historically in the 20th century, especially, and in Indigenous scholars, contemporary Indigenous scholars, because sometimes there's this fear, or not fear, but just not really. There's there is a siloing of experiences, as if Indigenous experiences are completely different or cannot learn from other marginalized people's experiences and how people have responded. Indigenous people have been greatly impacted by Black social movements in the United States and Canada. And I think that, looking at and having Indigenous students read and learn about other marginalized peoples, how they have responded, and to see how that has influenced Indigenous people and how it can still influence Indigenous people, I think is one way in which, thinking about and tackling power structures within universities, because most Indigenous students, when they come to university, they're, for the most part, want to go back to the communities and make a contribution to communities in various kinds of ways. And I think that, there's, by resisting or being open to other groups, other ways that people have responded, I think is fundamental for, I think, Indigenous students learning, and also providing the kinds of tools that are needed to survive in a university.
Great, thank you. Renaud.
Yeah, the question of power is an interesting one to me, and again, I'll probably be singing the same tune, but maybe I'll come to it from a different way, which is to say that the question of what constitutes power in the university at this present moment has very much to do with two counter moments. A moment I think that Rob was just pointing to, that when Indigenous students show up, when Black students show up, when students from other historically marginalized groups show up, there's a sense of a certain kind of contestation. but there's also a sense that they have to be contained. And so, the question for me around power is very much situated in the question of, well, what kind of world do you want to make? And what role can the contemporary university work in making the vision of that world come into view? So I'm very much, when I think about the university, I very much often turn to Stuart Hall's formulation as that formulation that he has of within and against. And then a number of ways in which I think, students can both be repelled and seduced by the university. The university claims to be this democratic, open institution. But on closer inspection, you begin to realize the university is one of the most conservative institutions in modern life. So, but nonetheless, it's able to use even events like this as the evidence of its democratic, liberal, open-mindedness. So we have to be within and against the university. And we have to refuse the seductions of becoming, as Stuart Hall again teaches us, fluent in theory or fluent in particular kinds of theories, but minus a politics. So again, the kind of question is, what is your politics, right? Black studies has been in the university for over 50 years. And Black studies is both Black studies and feminist studies, women's studies are really interesting examples of both possibility in the university and containment. The manner in which rewards and recognitions and celebrations are used to contain, but also to discipline, are used to also break apart the possibility of communities. Black studies exist as an insurgent knowledge form in the university, not to prove that the university is actually a kind of liberal democratic place, but to actually prove that the edifice of Western European knowledge, of Euro-American knowledge, as I try to call it in my own work, that edifice is a deeply anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, and ultimately deadly edifice of knowledge. And we can see that scattered all around us today as we move closer and closer towards ecological disaster, as parts of the world are engulfed in wars, all of them, every single one of them, fueled by Euro-American greed and accumulations of wealth. So the kind of question then of what do we do in the university? What do we do with the knowledge that we make in the university? And I think Shaista was pointing to this, right? If we make knowledge in the university that only resides in the university, then we're not engaged in any project that points towards even the possibility of change. And that does not mean that we all become community workers. That's not the argument that I'm making here. The argument I'm making is one, that knowledge must do something more than reproduce the institution as we know it and live it and experience it at this moment. And so part of what happens in that contestatory moment is that when Black students arrive, when Indigenous students arrive, they also arrive with the possibility that knowledge can be more and do more and exceed the institution. And the institution is hell bent on curtailing that. The institution is hell bent on to use the formulation that we will discipline in that back into the perpetuation of the life of the university. So this is why it doesn't matter how many Black deans we have, how many Indigenous provosts we have, how many Dalit presidents we have, and so on, if we have them or had them. It doesn't matter if their politics is a politics of the reproduction of the institution. So we can celebrate and we can recognize and we can clap our hands and stamp our feet for the Black women presidents and the Black women provosts and the Indigenous women presidents and provosts. But when the institutions continue to reproduce themselves year after year, month after month, in the same image as when it was only white men running them, we know that we have either lost the game or that we have to find new tactics and strategies for intervening much more profoundly and deeply, transformatively, in the university.
Great, thank you.
I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Again, thank you, Rob and Ronaldo. So I wrote down this, just this one sentence from a speech that I read again and again, and, probably have understood only a quarter of it to date. So this is a speech by Baba Sahib, more officially known as Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who is a Dalit who continues to be, I use present tense for him, a Dalit revolutionary thinker, leader with 2 PhDs at a time when, most Dalits, it's still the reality for us, heterogeneous communities of us to be uneducated and not have access to educational institutions of especially higher education, higher ed studies. And so, B.R. Ambedkar, in a speech that, he was going to deliver and from which he was disinvited once the organizers read the content of the speech, they were like, oh shit, and sorry for swearing. I'm trying not to. I blame it on fasting because, I'm sleepy and then I swear a lot when I'm sleepy. So Ambedkar said this one sentence that is extremely important. And he said, caste must be annihilated, and the adjacent word that we use for annihilation is abolition. So many of us, Dalit, Muslim, Bahujan feminist scholars, we use the word abolition for this context. And so Ambedkar said caste must be annihilated because one can never build anything on foundations of caste. And, for me, thinking about power relations, of course, are, genocidal power relations. So we are not just talking about, the position of the chair or the dean or the EVC chancellor, all of those, which is also there. But, but talking about it in the context of genocide, which, as Muslims, we have several instances in the present moment of Muslims undergoing genocide. Of course, we live on lands where indigenous peoples, Black people becoming kinless are going under genocide, it continues. And, what does it mean? What does it mean? When I was thinking about these questions, one of the things I was going to say and give examples of how in California, which is now my context and has been for the last 5 years, we are, fighting for caste equity. And so for example, in March, and this is not easy work. This is not like, where Savarna, which is caste dominant people or white people say, oh, come and bring caste in, add caste to a protected category. It doesn't happen this way because there's a case against Cisco that's that's ongoing, as you know. And there are also other cases, and one at my own university, something that I just finished fighting just last month. So I was going to say that caste, and I do make this argument that caste needs to become more legible, that people need to understand that we are brown people, not the same. So just as a very quick example, there is a scholar, there's a historian at UCSD, Todd Henry, who did some extremely orientalizing and harmful work with Koreans. And, we know white people's obsession with Asia continues. And so he did really harmful work with that, and people understood, and they were like, fuck this or fuck that. And then there was a case of Saiba Verma, and she is the daughter of RAW agent, RAW being the equivalent of CIA in India. And her father was the aviation. Her father was the head of aviation unit of RAW in 1990s, which was the bloodiest decade of colonial violence in Kashmir, where there were whole towns that were raped, from children as young as 6 to women as old as 60 in one night, and men were also raped. So everybody was raped. And so all of those histories of rape and, kidnappings and mass graves, unnamed, unmarked graves, all of those things began in the 90s, which was the bloodiest decade, or one of the bloodiest decades in occupation of Kashmir, which is a 436-year-old occupation, right? And so Saiba Verma, who is, she is, so I'm in ethnic studies, which is in division of social sciences. Saiba Verma is a professor in anthropology, which is, again, the same division as mine. And this woman who has this history of, genociders, familial I'm not talking about complicity in a structural way. I'm talking about, being in bed with colonizers, bedding them, being born from them, that kind of familial history, goes to Kashmir and studies psych patients. And she sits in on testimonies of psych patients. And Kashmir has, one of the highest. Doctors Without Borders released a report in 2016 that said Kashmir has the most cases of colonized people with mental trauma. Okay, so to go to a psych clinic, which I think was the only public psych clinic in Srinagar, which is, one of the most brutal occupations in the world and often compared with Gaza as an open air prison. And she goes and she writes testimonies. She does this study at Cornell University. God knows how her IRB passed through. Then she comes to UCSD. She publishes this book with Duke University. She gets tenure at my university. And when it was revealed to us, we always thought her book was problematic, but when it was revealed to her that her father was the raw agent, and he was alive at that time, this is 2 years ago, we tried to bring her to accountability, at which point the university, she through the university lodged a complaint against me. And at that time, I knew that I was going to lose my job. I might still lose my job. So what I'm saying is that, there are real issues, that our careers might end, and this continues. So, so what I'm saying is that in that university, at my university, thinking about caste, where a top admin said the worst casteist and Islamophobic things about me publicly, didn't care, because how do I matter? And if they can do this to a faculty member, imagine what they do to students. And at this university, thinking about power, challenging power, along the, lines of caste, but also coloniality, has convinced me that caste equity is not the answer. Caste has been outlawed in India in the constitution, and look at how genocide continues at the site of caste in India. Okay, and I say this as a Pakistani Dalit, where caste is not a site of genocide, and yet, it's the proximity also that matters. So here is what I'm going to say. Caste is not going to end until all colonialisms end. Okay, caste cannot be detached from coloniality, from dehumanization, from genocide. So until the white settler states of Canada and the US, but also the Brahminical settler state of India disintegrates, caste is not going to end. And this is a really hard argument to make, because many Dalit scholars, rightly so, and I have all the empathy in the world for the experiences that they have, which I don't as a diasporic person, have been seduced by this logic of caste equity. And they say that this is what would shift the power relations. And while I think that, it will, in the sense of making caste legible, nothing will be shifted. It's not just about ending the university, which needs to be ended, but the colonial states from India to the US, everywhere, they need to be ended as well. And so for me, caste liberation is inherently tied to liberation of Kashmir, which is, of course, inherently, Azad. Isa has a book that just released on India and Kashmir, India and Israel and their connections. So what I'm saying is that Brahmanism must end. For that, India needs to end as a settler state. India is a settler state. It is not the land of, Julia Roberts' film. I can't remember the name of the film, but you know which one I'm talking about. So that is the important argument that I want to make. How do we make caste legible? Along with them, reform and revolution need to go together. And some people say, oh, well, others say I'm too old and I've lost my mind, and for others I'm still young, and so they say it's utopia. And I do want to say to dominant caste scholars that while you cite Adrienne Marie Brown, and for some of them it's in their what do you call it, Twitter bio, Adrienne Marie Brown's a tweet about moving towards the impossible, they never believe that their power can be challenged as well. They never believe that caste can be ended. And here I want to say that caste can be ended because Babasaheb Ambedkar put forth this, offering that caste needs to be annihilated. And I think that's the only way for us, from my position where I'm sitting, that we can think about, we can actually ethically talk about power relations in the university. I'm so sorry. I think I took way more than 4 minutes, but I'll stop here.
No problem. These are very insightful and incisive comments, and very important, and a lot of food for thought for everybody. Moving into the next discussion, and I think what you just said really highlights this and moves us along nicely, is to think about justice. So we were analyzing power, we were thinking about power. One of the things that you mentioned earlier in your talk was about deepening some of these questions. So I would like to have a discussion around justice. What does justice look like? But also, how do we deepen the question of justice? Because justice is thrown around all the time. But what is a deep way of engaging with the concept of justice when we're thinking about ongoing, continuing power dynamics that are entrenched, where, you know, we're talking about abolition or annihilation, and we're also talking about the lives of students, we're talking about the lives of faculty, we're talking about the lives of future people. What do we think about when we talk about justice? And what does justice look like from different perspectives? So that's the next question.
Me, right? Okay. I think this is I think that, really challenging the notion, the racialization of people of color, indigenous people, and I've talked specifically about indigenous people, but racialization of people of color, indigenous people that were, indigenous people are considered to be dangerous. They're a threat, and this leads to or guides the way in which white people, particularly, basically, how white people will react or respond to indigenous presence, and the way in which, and it's usually violent, whether it's literal physical or not, it's usually is a response is violence. And I had a first-year student in my intro to Indigenous studies a few years back, and I've had about three of them, on three different occasions. I had first-year white women, first-year students, who said that in Saskatoon, who believed that to get into an Indian gang, a Native gang in Saskatoon, you had to rape a white girl. That was the belief that they had growing up in Saskatoon, going to high school in Saskatoon. And, and of course, that if young white girls, young women believe this about young indigenous men, white guys believe that too. And so that is going to really guide the way in which they respond to the presence of young indigenous men in their coming into their sphere. And certainly we saw that with Colton Bushi and him being shot in the back of the head, unarmed, and shot in the back of the head by a white guy. And I think that until white people can address their racist attitudes that they have, justice is going to be very difficult to actually be obtained, because there cannot be justice for indigenous people, for Black people, for people of color, if white people are scared of them. If white people believe that indigenous people and Black people and people of color are inherently dangerous. And I think that what we have to do is that means that places all the work on indigenous people, Black people, people of color, to tell to white people what about their racist attitudes. And yet there's the resistance and there's the backlash and that people of color have to endure. So I think that, you know, justice, even as a move towards justice, is for white people to look at their racist ideas that they have.
Thank you. Ronaldo, are you look deep in thought right now, so I don't want to.
Yeah, no. So, you know, the question of justice it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one because, you know, in modern liberal democracies, we have this logic of justice as something that's continually unfolding. And somehow it's this kind of linear process where people move from being oppressed to achieving their freedom and liberation. But of course, that model of justice is one that actually, sorry to repeat myself, that actually keeps in place the very systems of oppression that people need release from. So, you know, it's only the oppressed who can say what justice is, what it looks like, and when it has been achieved. But that's not the model of justice that we're often asked to work with. The model of justice that we're often asked to work with is what I've been hinting to before, you know, one that is concerned with individual forms of recognition and reward and representation and so on. So for my thinking and the way that I've been taught to think about these questions is that there's no sense of talking justice unless we're talking about liberation. And there's no sense of talking liberation if we're not talking about making another world. And so, you know, any kind of justice-oriented project that is not linked to making another world, which means overthrowing the one that we currently have, bringing the one that we have to an end, as Sylvia Winter would say, to its logical conclusion, it's not a justice-oriented project. Having said that, there are all kinds of ways in which we can make reformist moves that stand in for the moment as forms of compromise towards making that other move, right? So the language and the rhetoric of reconciliation, of reparations, all of these are, in my view, compromised situational moves if understood as part of a project towards liberation. If they're understood as forms of justice that keep in place the very structures that made them necessary in the first instance, then they're nothing but newer and more persuasive forms of ongoing colonization and anti-Black racism and so on. So for me, justice is a contested term, a contested idea. And the way in which one comes to this question of justice has everything to do with whether or not one sees this world as one that needs to be perpetuated in a particular kind of way, or one that needs to come to a blunt conclusion and new forms, new imaginary ways of conceiving of social life come into place. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to say that I actually don't know the answer to that question. I have just started to read Ismaili, you know, so I identify as Muslim, as a Shia, but in that, you know, a very minor sect of Shiism is Ismailism, and, you know, our histories of how we became, you know, from Dalits, how we became Muslims is also very, very different than how, you know, Sunni Islam worked in India. So whatever little history that I'm able to glean, whatever philosophies that I'm able to understand, I'm working with those, because, you know, Ronaldo just said that another world, and I read the words of Indigenous and Black scholars in particular who talk about another world, Billy Balcourt, others who talk about it. I do not understand what that means, right? So even I know it's contradicting myself because I said caste can be annihilated completely, but it's also that, you know, some of the things, and I wrote about it, you know, well, recently, as in whatever, 2021, same difference, right? But we have some of us, and Ronaldo, thank you for saying that. What is theory without politics? And I think that's what grad school made me for the most part. Somebody who could piece together complicated words and be proud of myself, but I had lost my way somewhere in that. Especially when we make certain kinds of people into our heroes, and heroes always fall flat on their faces if we live long enough, right, to see that. So, so all this to say that, I'm going to quietly continue reading Ismaili, Islamic, Indigenous, Black, Latinx philosophies and histories, and try to think about this, because and definitely, of course, Dalit histories, and philosophies and autobiographies, because I really don't know what that other world, how to get to that other world. It's an idea and it's something that I believe in, but what that can look like, those of us who've never lived outside the contours of dehumanization, we don't know. It's hard to ask people like me what justice is, because I don't know for now, though I know my ancestors did. Working in indigo vats, they must have thought that, there is a better world for them. Otherwise, they would not have continued working until their breaths were blue, and they died from that. They died from indigo vats. Yeah, I'll stop here. Sorry for being incoherent, but I really don't know the answer to that.
Oh, that's really important. I think that you highlight something that is really essential for our thinking as a collective. Is we are doing creative work, and creative work is going into the unknown. And if we're going to go into the unknown, we need to go in not knowing, and that's important. So I think that's really valuable and really powerful, to say that you don't know. So thank you for that. Now, unless you all want to respond to anything else about justice, there are questions. Yes.
I just want to say that I really appreciate what Ronaldo had to say about working towards, because I know that for some people, any level of compromise or cooperation or collaboration equals co-optation, and because that will reinforces the colonial structures that oppress us. But the only problem with that is that there are no rooms then for small victories, because small victories are appeasement and reinforces those structures. But at the same time, without some sort of compromise or collaboration or cooperation, the daily lives of Indigenous people and Black people and people of color do not change at all. And so it is and it's sort of like a place mark or working towards, and unless, we are talking about actual revolution, picking up guns and fighting, and then, because otherwise there will be no short answer, right? There's no short work to this. And even revolution may not be the best strategy, although it may be satisfying at certain levels to fight back in revolution, armed fight back. But I think that there's for the now and the people who are struggling today, and small victories do help, even though it may be seen as appeasement and as being reinforcing the structures.
Thank you. That's really important. Ronaldo, you have your mic off. Did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that to kind of suggest that the vision of another world is not one that is guaranteed. It doesn't come with an agenda and a program, but working with some notion that the one that we have now needs to end. So less so a political program and more so a set of political intentions around what it is that we are working against and pointing towards. And I know that, since the late 60s, for this wide-ranging thing of people we call the left, and even more so after 89, when the fall of the wall, that we have been suspicious of any kind of grand narrative that points towards a liberatory project in the future. But that's something that I think we need to reassess, that the way in which political transformation happens is that some people are willing to risk saying what it is they actually need, and not only saying that, but then working towards it. So we have to risk putting a vision of the future into some kind of language so that we know what it is we're actually working for, that we can find ourselves kind of trapped in a kind of hesitation, a kind of fear and shame or ridicule to say, actually we want a world where there are no prisons, and that's possible. Actually, we want a world where all of the Earth's resources are not only stored but equally shared, and this is how we can do it, and not be ashamed to say that, because it used to be that we could do that, but now we live in an era where people are ashamed to say quite openly and honestly, we want a world where people only work for the capitalist machine 20 hours a week, right? And to work towards that. And so we have to recapture a certain kind of vitality to our politics and our imaginaries, because what capitalism and neoliberal capitalism in particular, I say this all the time, has been really brilliant at doing is having us imagine the world only within its own horizons. And so we've been trapped in those horizons, I would argue, since 68 and on. And we have to find a way to break out of those horizons. And it's not that other visions of a different world are not with us. It's why people still take to the streets. It's why Indigenous peoples everywhere are in resistance to what is happening on their lands. It is why Black peoples are organizing, even though I have a critique of reparations, are organizing reparations movements globally. It's all of these, the fact that people remain in resistance to the ways in which capitalist social forces have shaped our lives is something that I think we can take tremendous inspiration from. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. I think that both of those follow-up comments were really, really helpful and really important. Shaista, would you like to follow up with anything, or should we move on to questions from our attendees? So now we're going to move on. I think that this conversation for me, first of all, thank you very much, is very deep, is very powerful, is touching on all of the, I don't want to make a generalization, since I talked about how it's important not to make generalizations, but so many of the very deep issues, it got deeper than what often narratives and discourses happen. So thank you for doing that, and for the bravery of that, and the need for it. So thank you for doing that. I'm going to now share some questions from our attendees. I'm going to read it out loud, and then we can figure out who would like to answer it. So the first one, I'm just going to use first names. For question from Sharanjit is, how can we work towards making university spaces to call out publicly and openly? I'm tired of being put into situations where the academy, EDI experts, white admin, privileged admin, silo these conversations as a way to keep conversations silenced and one-on-one. The outspoken ones become pariahs. So how do we create capacity to embolden and empower those who call out? That's the question. Would you like me to repeat the question? Or do you have a response? Okay.
I'll say that, you know, as someone who is willing to say what I think most times publicly, one, we should understand that refusal should be done in community, that it can't be an individual project. So even though you might hear an individual voice, hopefully that voice is speaking from, supported by, in the context and speaking with a community. That's the first time I want to say. But more specifically to the question is that if you want to do that kind of work, you have to be attuned and aware that there's certain kinds of things that are not going to accrue to you. As I've said, you're not going to be rewarded for it. You're not going to be celebrated. You're not going to get recognition because you're speaking against the very system that awards those privileges, and you want to transform that system. So that system is going to be hostile to you. You've put yourself in a war position. And once you're in a war position, you are in fact at war. So if you're at war, you can't imagine that your opponents are going to play nice with you. And that's why it is like, I'm not an organizer, but I'm always waiting for people to organize me, because that's why we need people with organizational skills to organize us so that our refusals are deeply effective. And even if change doesn't occur in our time, that we have laid the foundations for change to occur. So it can be dispiriting if you're doing this stuff alone, but if you're doing this stuff in community, it is less dispiriting. And it also allows you to reflect on not just the things that you have won or achieved, but to reflect deeply and honestly on your losses and to think about how you come back from them in ways that are more useful, more solidly community oriented, and so on.
Yeah. Oh, Shaista, you want to go? Oh, okay. Okay. Well, you know, I completely agree. Completely. I mean, I've seen, and you think about the students who want to, you know, voice their opinions and the kinds of you know, challenges and that students will have in trying to voice their opinion. Even for faculty, you know, I've seen where there've been a group of Indigenous faculty, you know, express the, you know, call out faculty who were and not just a call up, but, you know, submit a report, you know, that about an Indigenous a faculty member at a university who was who falsely claimed to be Indigenous, and it was not that faculty that was then you know, investigated by the university. It was that faculty that was protected by the university, and the Indigenous faculty were the ones that were attacked, right? And so, I mean, eventually the university had to change its position, but those faculty that did who stepped forward publicly and went to the press, they were the ones who were continued to be marginalized. People have left, people have been quieted. And so even when you think that tenured faculty who are protected are not protected, it becomes very difficult. And this was a group of Indigenous faculty. And so, and although the result was what was supposed to have happened, the way in which it got there created a lot of distrust and a lot of bad feelings that are still, I don't know if they're being repaired or, you know, what kind of moves have been happening, but nonetheless, you know, it is better, as Ronaldo said, as a community. At least you have, you know, the support when the attack comes. You have the support system in place and people to help. But as Ronaldo said, the ones who are coming forward are the ones that are going to be attacked because they're the ones who are challenging the institution.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Ronaldo. I think everything important has been said, but I just want to say, you know, thinking back to an ethic put forward by, you know, Professor Eve Tuck, who was my mentor for my PhD, my supervisor. And one of the things that I have learned from her, that is not just in saying, but also as a writing practice, you know, working with her, I realized just how colonial my writing continues to be, but at least she's, you know, she's trained me to begin to see that how colonialist and anti-Black and dehumanizing and all of those things my writing is. And I'm sure it continues to be. But one of the things that she said, so what I'm saying, it's not just, you know, something, it's not outside of the academic work we do, but she said, you know, bite the hand that feeds you. And I think, you know, I try to bite the hand that feeds me. And one of the consequences of that is, you know, coming very close to losing this job. And as somebody who does not come from class privilege and, you know, working class background of Uber drivers and others, you know, in my family, you know, it's not always easy. You know, it's not always easy because I think especially tenured full profs become very complacent, become very used to, you know, traveling to conferences where, you know, we are staying at particular kinds of hotels and, you know, ordering particular kinds of dinners. And so I think some of the internal work, you know, we talk about the systemic and, you know, the individual versus the systemic, but I think, you know, for me, and, you know, I speak about this from my positionality, I think, you know, holding on to community, which for me is a faith community of Shia Ismailis and, you know, being guided by that ethic, but also like, you know, a sense of spirituality, that there is something more than just this world, which for me has been really important in how, you know, in trying to continuously, it's not that, you know, you bite the hand once and then you're done, like you have to keep biting it every day. And I think, you know, that has really given me some courage. So, you know, I would say in response to this question that, you know, finding community, finding whatever, you know, drives you, whether it's your faith, a sense of spirituality, you know, nurture that, because I think that is really, really important in academia, where we become soulless and narcissist. And, you know, one way to survive academia is to be hyper narcissist. And most of us academics are super narcissist. And so I'll end there. Yeah. Thank you, Sharanjeev.
Great, thank you. The questions are coming fast and furious, so we're going to try to keep moving along with them and see if we can get to as many as possible. So another question from Sudrashan is, what does Safri justice look like for sites of intersectionality, especially of being queer, Dalit, Indigenous, Black, female, and other subaltern university students? Would you like me to repeat that question? What does justice look like for sites of intersectionality, especially when being queer, Dalit, Indigenous, Black, female, and other subaltern university students?
It's a good question, and I mean, I wouldn't dare to speak for students, as I keep saying that, you know, it's only those who are oppressed who know when justice has been achieved. So a formulation like that takes a lot. It means then that the people who hold particular forms of regulatory power have to now open themselves up to believing the people who they didn't believe before, right? So that's a tremendous transformational move. So I don't generally use the term intersectionality, but I speak to you as a Black gay man. And all of that is informing what I'm speaking to you today and how I'm speaking to you today. And I bring those experiences to the table as a professor and a thinker. The kind of question then of, like, subaltern peoples who come from, however we want to phrase this, historically oppressed groups. And then how do we navigate these institutions that I began by saying the university itself is one of the principal sites of the very problem that we seek to address. It is in fact in the university that the studies that claim that Black people are inherently criminal, that they have low IQs, that's where they're made. It's the studies in psychology departments that study Indigenous people and problems with alcohol that reproduce the stereotypes and so on about Indigenous people and learning and criminality and so on. The university itself is the site of the problem that we're seeking to address. So when we enter the university, coming from these communities with these histories, we have to be aware that we have now entered into one of the principal sites of the production of knowledge and ideas and the perpetuation of knowledge and ideas that seeks to dehumanize us. So if we don't enter with that kind of awareness, then we can succumb to the violences that it will further enact on you. If you enter it with that kind of awareness, then you know that you're in a contestatory space. Then you know that you have to be, at the mildest, be pushing back against what is coming your way. At the most extreme, you have entered it to destroy it. That's the underpinning philosophical impulse of Black studies in the academy. It enters the academy to undo the academy. It enters the academy to bring, as Sylvia Winter would say, these last 500 plus years to an end. Hopefully with that end, something more livable emerges. But as Stuart Hall would say, there are no guarantees.
All right, I think we got nods here, so we'll keep moving on to the next question. I think that was a little bit of a mic drop moment, so we'll keep going. Next question from Aisha. Please, could you explain what you mean when you say caste can be annihilated? Is that different from saying racism can be annihilated?
I guess that's cue for me to speak. So, that Ronaldo and Rob are also putting forth this idea, this knowledge that, we have to, justice is as interesting and important as that word is, and particularly for some traditions, it is the question of liberation that we are thinking about. And the quote that I read from Ambedkar that said that nothing can be built on the foundation of caste. And so if we do believe that, abolition is possible, if we do believe that decolonization is possible, we have to firmly believe, especially as, people who do come from, this history of oppression or of oppressors, that is older than that of white supremacy by 2000 years. I mean, that says something, even when putting it in terms of like numbers, to think that history of white supremacy as old as it is, and Black people, from what I've read, like the limited that I've read, were drawn with purple ink to represent evil as early as 5th century. So it's not to say that white supremacy only started in 1492, but that to say that it's so anti-Blackness is it takes on so many different forms that it's even to say that only white people are anti-Black, which is not true. So what I'm trying to say is that, if we do believe that all of these justices, all of these liberations are possible, we have to believe that caste can be annihilated. And by annihilation of caste, what I've seen dominant caste scholars and sometimes students do is they drop their last names, and they think that, their complicity ends because, last names is often a very important way of identifying people as Dalit, of identifying people as, caste oppressed or caste dominant. And so, when you have a particular last name, it opens up it either opens up or closes lots of doors on you. But that is not what I mean, or what Babasaheb Ambedkar meant by caste annihilation. Caste annihilation is, thank you, Ronaldo, for, giving me again, I lose my way. I think about, fuck this, caste can be annihilated. And then I'm like, can caste be annihilated? So, so thank you to Indigenous and Black scholars who keep guiding our work, who've been writing this longer, at least, than Dalit scholars have, or at least in English that I can read. So, so caste can be annihilated. Race can be annihilated. If we are saying that dehumanization needs to end, dehumanization cannot end until, the structures, the structures that support racial thinking, the structures that support casteist thinking are annihilated. And caste can be annihilated. One way is to think about complicity. Another way is to think about your family histories. If you are from a family of genociders, what is your responsibility? What does it mean for you to be caste dominant and work and say, Black Lives Matter, when you've never talked about, how caste is one of the oldest structures of incarceration. So to say caste can be annihilated, it means you begin with your complicity. You begin to genuinely challenge the structures of violence in all their intersectionality. So caste can be annihilated, but it's about how you begin, not by dropping your last name, which shows your caste privilege. What does it mean for somebody like me to have my last name, for example, and coming from the histories that I do, but to actually challenge the structures. And Rob and Ronaldo can be more coherent than I just was. So, yeah.
Thank you. Would you all like to continue the response or move to the next question?
I think we move on to the next question. Shaista answers the question.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Next question is from Shri. Speaking as a dominant caste person, I can completely agree with the need for reimagining abolition and total change, burning it all down for a just world. But for people of privileged identities, this other world of respect and being a full human already exists. So what is the incentive for the lay privileged person to ever give it up? It has to be taken by force. If any of you have a comment on this, I'll be grateful.
I think that they are living as full humans, if that's the category that we want to use, might not actually be the case. That they are as much captured by and subservient to the reproduction of the social forces that make them superior as the people that they are oppressing. But the consequences are different. So they're as much consumed by reproducing caste hierarchy, reproducing the social relations that make them dominant. And that in and of itself is not a full life either, because one has to be continually attentive and continually engaging in forms and practices of social ordering and behavior to maintain those hierarchies. So the thing about these forms and practices is that we all become captive to them in different kinds of ways. We all become incarcerated by them in different kinds of ways. And this is why, the white abolitionists coined the term race traitors, right? We have to become traitors to caste position to heterosexuality, to all of the kinds of positions that assume their superiority for how we are as social beings, for how the species should organize its social relations. And that demands that we be attentive to how we get inducted and seduced into the kind of histories of our social life that exists long before we are even born, right? And so, because we're talking about universities and this university, part of why the university remains seductive to somebody like myself is because I actually do believe, and I come from a history and a philosophy within Black studies, where we know that these things are taught and learned, and therefore can be untaught and unlearned. That's the struggle, that's the contestation, that's the paradox. And the people who seek to maintain these forms of hierarchy are fully aware of that too. This is why so many of them find their lives in the university. This is why right now authoritarianism everywhere is attacking universities, attacking libraries, attacking writers, attacking anyone who can teach us, who can help us to think about other ways of shaping our social relations. So they're not living full lives as members of the species. They're actually living partial lives. They might be partial lives of great access and security and so on. But to maintain that, they have to engage routinely in these violences so that they become legible one to another vis-a-vis the others that they want to keep out.
Would other people like to add on anything to that? I think that was a very, yeah, that was great. And I want to echo that. I think that the violence happens everywhere, and the dehumanization happens to everybody, and that radical reimagining of what it means to be able to be fully human in all of the spaces that you exist and embody is part of that stepping into the unknown of what that could actually be and what that could look like. So I really thought that that was a powerful response. Next question. Let's see. Okay, question from Yuvraj. How should students coming from marginalized caste backgrounds navigate the deeply violent university space, especially when most peers and professors in South Asian studies departments are upper caste folks who are quick to dismiss caste realities, concerns, and anger as too radical or sometimes even inappropriate?
So I thank you for asking that question. Speaking from experience as somebody who almost failed out of her PhD and dropped out twice and thought would never finish. And it took me a while to understand, because I used to say to this other supervisor of mine that I'm from here, but I'm also from there, and I want to bring in those histories. And how do I do this? One of the things that every time I say this about Eve, she rolls her eyes, but it's true that she did save me. And if she had not started at OISE, from where I did my PhD at the University of Toronto, I would not have come back into my PhD, especially being dropped in an email 3 weeks after my father passed away was traumatizing for me. And she came and she was like, Shaista, come back, work with me. All this to say is that, South Asian, dominant caste South Asians for the most part are extremely, mirror reflections of white supremacists on the streets or in our classrooms or in our departments. So do not look up to them. Look for Indigenous scholars, look for Black scholars, those who would understand, your/our struggles against dehumanization. And, sometimes one of the things that I have realized, as somebody who this is a side note, but I'm old and I've gotten ranty now. But, one of the things that will always stay with me is I was looking at a 19th century Bengali play that was, in Bengali anti-nationalist against the British anti-nationalist literature. It's considered to be a very, revolutionary, very, woke, using this word now. And I was critiquing this play because I was like, this is extremely anti-Muslim and extremely casteist. I remember, Eve saying that, oh, that's like Beyonce's Lemonade, and it's not, it wasn't that cool, but it stayed with me, and that gave me so much confidence. And I swear, I don't even know if she remembers this, but her saying this and to say that, and to think that, what I'm writing about is legible to her. She understands where I'm coming from, and that made all the difference to me. So what I'm saying is that please, especially for international students, do not come to work with, big superstar dominant caste scholars, even if they've written about caste, because we, those of us who now know their histories, know their stories, know about how they treat students, actually, their Dalit and Adivasi students as possessions for gaining street credit. So my suggestion is, it will take a while. It will take a while. I mean, there are so few Dalit scholars. A friend of mine and I, just in the context of California, we were trying to name Dalit scholars who are, publicly Dalit. And we realized that it's less than 1%, less than 1% in social sciences and humanities. And now think about how many brown South Asian faces you see in every single department, and out of that 1% or less than 1% is Dalit. And so, if you can find a Dalit scholar to work with, I mean, and a generous Dalit scholar, just because somebody's Dalit doesn't mean that they'll be, with you on the same page or, share your vision. That would be great. But I would say that try to find Black scholars, Indigenous scholars. We have so much also to share and to learn and to exchange our knowledges with these, with these peoples who would understand us way better than dominant caste scholars ever can. So.
Thank you very much. So we're close to being out of time. I wanted to highlight a few points and then also provide space for any final thoughts based on this conversation. There's a lot here. There's a lot to digest. I hope the audience, this will be available on YouTube. I hope the audience can revisit it because there's so many important concepts that were discussed and so many rich thoughts and rich insights that hopefully that people can revisit this. Three points that I thought were really really vital and full of tension. And I think that the tension is valuable. I think tension is important because we're working in a space of tension, and that's our reality here. One was the idea of collaboration and the tension between the abrupt stop and jumping into the new and the unknown, and the immediate, small, kind of contested, compromised movements. I think that tension is something that is really important to continue to grapple with, and I think that's something that we can continue to talk about. Another thing that I thought was really powerful was the idea of becoming fully human and how that needs to be everywhere. And I think that not that we can't become fully human, but that society can be recreated so that people are allowed to be embodying their full humanness. And I think that that's something that's really important alongside the question of not knowing what the future could be and jumping into this unknown future, while also recognizing that we live here in the present, that people have real, they have their lives that they really need to have a, way to eat, a way to live, a way to survive, and thinking about that tension. And I think that that's something to continue to move forward with. So there are dozens of other things worth discussing, but I just wanted to pull those out because I think that those are avenues forward for deep conversation. So as we wrap up, I'd like to offer you the opportunity to say any final thoughts about this conversation. If you want to make a final point, feel free to do so, and then Shika will wrap up and we will call it a session. We can go with the same order as we started with.
Okay. All right. So yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation and hearing what Shaista and Ronaldo had to say. It was really enlightening for me. I think that some of the conversations or some of the talking points you mentioned, and also some of the questions in terms of safety on university campuses these are the kinds of critical kinds of thinking and question that need to be discussed more, right? And certainly with people with a lot more tools in their toolbox than me, but nonetheless, as I'm kind of reflecting about some of the things that I've seen in the university, one of the things that is kind of important, I think, is that for about Indigenous students is that probably about 75%, 65% of Indigenous students are Indigenous women. And I think that is going to have, and that is having like a huge impact on the classroom. It's having huge in terms of who's in the classroom, the students, and who's in front of the classroom as professors. And I'm not sure what the ratio is for professors in terms of gender ratio, but definitely there are a lot more Indigenous women. And I think that the impact, and in fact, as Ronella was talking about, vice provosts, vice presidents, a lot of those positions are being filled by Indigenous women. I think that is going to have, at least, I'm pretty confident that it will have a long-term impact on universities and what we see in universities as moving forward. But that's just something that I was been thinking about. I just wanted to raise that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think first, I'm really pleased to be in conversation with Shaista and Rob. Thank you guys for bringing us together and hosting this conversation. It's been a pleasure. Look, I think that part of what we are living in the midst of potential change that can go either way. Change that can become the foundation for a world that is more livable for most of us, or change that could go well into forms of authoritarianism, where the absolute super wealthy really where we are ruled by the absolute super wealthy, not governed, but ruled by them. And so in place of that significant chasm, and I do think it's a significant chasm, I do think that we are really in a moment of the haves and the have-nots in a profoundly significant way that we haven't seen before. And so in between that, we've got governments and institutions like universities offering us things like representation and EDI and reparations and reconciliation and anti-caste initiatives. And all of these kinds of things are stealing the language of decolonization as a way to try to hold this very fragile compact in place. And I think we have to be really aware of what's being executed, because what's being executed in this moment and how it gets executed will have a lot to do with what kinds of futures we lay the foundations for. Do we lay the foundations for a future where the very, very wealthy rule the rest of us and we are at service of their beck and call? We can take Twitter as one tiny example of what's happening there, of how the very wealthy are manipulating life and our lives in the everyday. These are not small matters. Or we can take, what just happened with Dominion and Fox News. These are not small matters. But all of these moments are meant to, in some ways, hold us in place. And what they do is they prohibit, if you will, the other move, which is that when oppressed peoples begin to talk to each other, new visions of the world begin to emerge. But if we get only siloed in the reparations block, the reconciliation block, the anti-caste block, we don't end up talking to each other. But what ends up happening is that we're holding the system that produced all of those blocks in the first instance in place, while some of us begin to feel like, oh, it's hearing us. So we're in a pivotal time, I think, in global life. And I think that we're going to have to take more risks, but take them collectively. And I think we're going to have to be much braver in putting some flesh on the bones of the world that we really want to make. So thank you for allowing me to say these things this morning and this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you again, and just how I could not have imagined sharing screen space with, people who are my professors. So thank you. This was genuinely an honor for me to be in the same space with Ronaldo and Rob. So thank you to the organizers. And, one thing that really, really hurts me that, is something that, when we say that Dalit women's lifespan is 39 years, which means that most of us, intersectionality matters, my, relative class privilege, academic position. So I'm not saying that, we are everybody Dalit is going to die at 39, but that's the general lifespan of Dalit women, in 2023, 2022, 39 years. And, we die faster. I go to my doctor and my body secretes some hormone that people who are very close to dying secrete. So now I'm taking medicines for that, and it's not to, present my trauma everywhere, but to say that these are the things that are killing us, that, the genocide in different ways does continue. And one of the things that really, really bothers me is that, the more that anti-caste work comes on the scene, the more dominant caste scholars, white scholars are becoming invested in anti-caste work, the more Dalit women and non-binary people are getting erased. So we became, we were disposable in the casteist world, and now the anti-caste, so-called anti-caste world that people are becoming invested in building through caste equity, through this, through that, we are becoming invisibilized. So when you think you're being very cool with critical caste studies or critical this studies, that studies, think about, why you're erasing Dalit feminist studies. There is a power to Dalit women and non-binary people's words. And so live ethically, please, because if you live ethically, we might live a bit longer than we are destined to live because of caste violence, and race violence and all of that. And last thing I want to say is, please check out Equality Lab's 2018 survey on how caste works in the United States. I think there's one in progress for Canada as well, but you can check out the one from the US. I teach it in my classes, and it makes a big difference in how students are taught to think about all of these systems of violence together. 2018 survey interviewed 1,500. There were 1,500 respondents, 47 questions, and it's eye-opening. And you can find it for free at the website for Equality Labs, and it's called Caste in the US survey. Okay, thank you again. Thank you to the organizers.
Thank you so much for those last thoughts and entire panel discussion. As a graduate student where I questioned my attention span, I was throughout listening attentively. It was that engaging. Thank you so much. It's very difficult to conclude those thoughts, and it's very difficult to conclude this conversation. So I would like to end by thanking everyone. Thank you, Joe, for moderating such a powerful conversation. And thank you, Professor Shaista, Professor Ronaldo, and Professor Rock for sharing your insight, lived experiences, and stories on the very important topic around safety, power imbalances, justice that affect racialized students across Turtle Island. These conversations are not only, important to not only critically analyze the existing unjust system, but also to think through the systemic barriers that maintain and exacerbate avoidable and unfair inequalities in power, resources, or opportunities across many marginalized and minority groups. Also, thank you to all those who submitted those questions and engaged in our conversation today. We hope that you walk away with more knowledge, more insights, and are moved to create a more equitable and inclusive academic landscape where all students have the same opportunities and support. On behalf of Poetic Justice Foundation and DICE, I would like to extend my gratitude to Shaista for acknowledging the stolen land we are situated on. I would also like to thank the team that worked behind the scenes to make this happen. Manmeet and Aditya, who supported us in the back end with technical assistance and program flow, and Jagreet for the marketing and communication support. I would also like to shout out to all my friends and colleagues whose work and support inspired today's event. And I would like to thank all the attendees who invested their time to be here and become a part of this amazing conversation. And if you are not already doing so, make sure you follow Poetic Justice and DICE on all social media platforms for more information on upcoming events and programming. Thank you so much.